I am Rabbi Dennis, and for as long as I can remember, my life has revolved around faith. Every day, my heart, mind, and spirit have been dedicated to serving God and offering guidance to those who seek spiritual wisdom. As a leader of my community, my mission has always been clear: to uplift others and continually point them to the enduring truths of the Torah. For many years, I believed my faith to be unbreakable, my understanding of God secure. I was born into a deeply religious family where the presence of God was woven into every part of life. Some of my earliest memories are of my grandfather, a man of profound devotion, sharing stories of the prophets, Moses parting the sea, Elijah summoning fire from the heavens. I clung to his every word, feeling a powerful connection to these stories of unyielding trust in God. By the time I reached adulthood, my path was unmistakable. I knew I would dedicate my life to God, immersing myself in His Word and helping others walk in His ways. Becoming a rabbi felt as natural as breathing. I poured myself into studying the Torah, finding deep joy in discovering its wisdom and sharing it with those around me. For decades, I led prayers, taught scripture, and delivered sermons to my congregation. I stood with them through both their most joyful celebrations and their darkest trials, officiating weddings, welcoming newborns, sitting by hospital beds, and mourning with them at funerals. These moments were far more than duties to me. They were sacred opportunities to serve God by serving His people. Each day began the same way. Before the first light of dawn, I would wrap myself in my tallit, recite the morning blessings, and feel a deep connection to the generations of Jews who had prayed those same words before me. Leading services and teaching Torah brought me profound fulfillment. When someone's eyes lit up with new understanding, or I heard heartfelt gratitude from someone I had counseled, I was reminded of my purpose. My faith was not just something I lived by, it was the core of my being. Yet even the strongest faith is not immune to the trials of life. It began with a subtle weariness, the kind that's easy to dismiss as a sign of aging or overwork. I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. The work of a rabbi is never-ending, and I had long grown accustomed to pushing past exhaustion. But then came a persistent pain in my stomach. At first it was a dull discomfort, but it gradually sharpened and refused to fade. I tried to ignore it, relying on prayer to carry me through, but it remained. My wife, Miriam, my steadfast partner and anchor, noticed the change. When she insisted I see a doctor, I finally relented, more to ease her concerns than because I believed anything serious was wrong. I can still vividly recall the day of the diagnosis. Sitting in the doctor's office, I heard the words, but they seemed distant, almost unreal. Stage 4. Pancreatic cancer. The words echoed in my mind, heavy and relentless. For a moment, it felt as if the very ground beneath me had disappeared. I thought of the many families in my congregation who had received similar news. I remembered standing beside them, offering words of faith and hope. Now, those same words seemed distant, almost foreign, as if spoken by someone else. As Miriam and I walked out of the doctor's office, silence hung between us. I saw the fear etched in her face, though she tried to stay composed. There was little to say. We both knew the weight of what we had just heard. Yet as the gravity of the situation sank in, I made a choice. I would confront this trial, as I had all others, through faith. I prayed fervently, asking God for strength, clarity, and the courage to endure, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. Soon after, the treatments began. Chemotherapy was more punishing than I had imagined. The nausea, the unrelenting weakness, it felt as though my body was betraying me at every turn. Even so, I clung to my faith, leaning on prayer to sustain me. In those long, sleepless nights, I whispered verses from the Psalms, seeking comfort in the words that reminded me of God's abiding presence. Even in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Yet moments of doubt crept in. Late at night, as the world lay silent around me, my mind became a storm of questions. Why is this happening to me? Did I fail in some way? Was this a punishment? I found myself drawn back to the stories I had taught for so many years, stories of prophets who endured great suffering, of Job who maintained his faith through unimaginable loss. This was my test, I told myself, a chance to prove the depth of my belief. But the illness continued to wear me down, sapping my strength day by day. Simple tasks became monumental. At times, I could barely stand. My family, always supportive, surrounded me with love and care, though I could see the fear in their eyes. Miriam never left my side. Her quiet presence, her hand in mine, gave me a sense of grounding, a reminder that I was not alone in this battle. Then came the night everything changed. After another exhausting round of treatment, I returned home barely able to walk. The pain in my stomach had intensified, but it wasn't just that. A tightness gripped my chest, sharp, unrelenting. I tried to call for Miriam, but the words wouldn't come. My vision blurred, and a strange darkness began to close in around me. I felt as though I were being pulled away from reality, slipping into some vast, silent void. And then something happened. Something that would forever alter my understanding of life, of faith, of God. But that moment is a story for another time. That night was different, ominous, as though a storm was building within me. The pain in my stomach sharpened like a blade, and the tightness in my chest left me gasping for air. Over the past months, I had learned to live with discomfort, but this was unlike anything before. It felt final. Miriam was beside me, her eyes wide with fear as she held my hand. "Let me call the doctor," she urged softly. I shook my head. I didn't want to spend another night in a sterile hospital room. I wanted to be home, surrounded by the things that reminded me of purpose and life itself. In the next room, I could hear my children whispering. They were trying to stay calm for my sake, but their voices betrayed their fear. They had watched me grow weaker each day, watched my once steady hands tremble, and my voice, once full of strength and conviction, fade to a fragile whisper. All I could do was pray and trust. Yet deep within me, I sensed that this night was leading to something beyond my comprehension. Something was about to change. I hated seeing the fear in their eyes, the way they looked at me, as if I were already slipping away. But deep inside, I knew they weren't wrong. As the hours dragged on, the pain became excruciating. I tried to pray, to focus on the words that had always brought me comfort. But the agony clouded my mind, drowning out the verses I had recited countless times before. "God," I whispered weakly, "if this is my time, grant me the strength to face it." I clung to my faith, though it felt as though I were grasping a rope unraveling beneath my fingers. The tightness in my chest worsened, each breath becoming shallower than the last. Through the haze, I heard Miriam's voice. "Dennis, stay with me!" she cried, her panic sharp and desperate. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything was fine. But no words would come. My vision blurred, the room around me fading like mist. The last thing I saw was Miriam's tear-streaked face as she called out my name. Then, nothing. Or so I thought. When I opened what I assumed were my eyes, I realized something was different. I wasn't in my body anymore. I was above it, looking down at the scene unfolding below me. Miriam was on the floor beside my lifeless form, shaking my shoulders, her sobs filled with anguish. My children burst into the room, their faces pale with fear. They frantically called for an ambulance, voices trembling. I saw myself, motionless, my chest unnervingly still. It was strange, almost surreal, to observe my own body as though it belonged to someone else. I expected to feel fear, panic, perhaps even despair, but instead there was a profound calmness. The pain was gone. The weight I had carried, physical, emotional, spiritual, was lifted. I felt light, free. I tried to speak, to tell them I was still here, but no sound came out. I reached toward Miriam, desperate to comfort her, but my hand passed through her as though I were nothing more than air. It was in that moment I understood. I was no longer tethered to the life I had known. The paramedics arrived swiftly, their voices urgent and commanding as they worked to revive me. The scene below became a whirlwind of activity, Miriam sobbing uncontrollably. My children huddled together, their faces stricken with fear. The medics shouted instructions to one another, their equipment beeping in a frantic rhythm. Yet all of it felt distant, like watching a scene through frosted glass. I wanted to reach out, to tell them I wasn't gone, that I was still here. But I was powerless to do so. A silent observer, caught between two realms. Then, something shifted. A light appeared, faint at first, no brighter than a flickering candle in the darkness. Slowly, it grew stronger, illuminating the space around me. It wasn't the harsh glare of hospital lights. This light was warm, soft, and alive, gently pulsing like the rhythm of a heartbeat. I felt it pulling me in, drawing me closer with a peace I hadn't known in months. It was as if the light were calling to me, inviting me forward. I drifted toward it instinctively, the chaos of the room fading behind me. The voices of the paramedics, Miriam's cries, the mechanical beeping, all dissolved into a gentle hum, distant and unimportant. The light wrapped around me like a warm embrace. It was comforting, yet overwhelming in its magnitude. I hesitated, unsure of what lay ahead. Was this death? Was this the presence of God? The very presence I had spoken of so many times in my life? I didn't know. Yet, I couldn't resist the pull. It was as if every fiber of my being longed for it. I began to surrender to the light, ready to follow wherever it might lead. But then, just as I felt myself slipping further into its embrace, I heard something. At first it was faint, a distant murmur barely audible over the peace surrounding me. But the sound grew clearer, more distinct. Voices, familiar voices calling out to me. I paused, torn between the comfort of the light and the pull of those voices. They were calling my name, urging me to listen. I strained to hear them, their words becoming clearer with each passing moment. Dennis. Familiar voices surrounded me, calling my name gently, lovingly. One of them was my mother's voice, the same voice that had sung lullabies to me when I was a child. Another belonged to my father, softly reciting a prayer I hadn't heard in years. Their voices stirred something deep within me, a longing, a profound sense of home. I moved closer to the light, feeling the pull intensify with each step. I didn't know what lay ahead, but there was no fear, only quiet anticipation. It was as if I stood on the threshold of something extraordinary. The voices grew stronger, more distinct, and the light enveloped me completely. I felt embraced by its warmth, as though the very essence of love and peace had wrapped itself around me. Dashin, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free. Free from pain, from fear, from the weight of the world. The light pulsed gently, almost as though it were alive, breathing in harmony with my soul. Then it began to shift. Within its glow, images started to form. Not outside me, but within the very light itself. As if it carried the story of my life, I saw myself as a young boy running barefoot through the fields near our home, laughing without a care in the world. I heard my mother's voice calling me inside for dinner, her words filled with that eternal kind of love that never fades. The scene transformed, and I saw myself as a teenager, engrossed in the study of Torah. My father stood nearby, watching with pride in his eyes. These moments were foundational, the bedrock of my faith. The images continued, each more vivid than the last. My ordination as a rabbi. The first time I stood before my congregation, trembling with nervousness as I delivered my inaugural sermon. The faces of the families I had comforted through their grief, the hands I had held at hospital bedsides, their gratitude, their tears of relief and hope, all of it flowed through me once more. I was reliving these sacred moments, and with each one, I felt a reaffirmation of the life I had chosen to dedicate to God. But then, something changed. The warmth of the light began to fade. A chill crept into the air, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The vibrant glow dimmed, and the soothing hum that had surrounded me was replaced by an unsettling silence. The images within the light shifted too, their colors dulled, becoming gray and lifeless. I felt an inexplicable tension in my chest, a knot forming in my stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but I couldn't understand what. As the light continued to dim, the silence was broken by a faint sound. At first, it was a barely audible whisper, like a breeze rustling through dry leaves. Then it grew, a low, anguished moan rising from the shadows. The sound intensified, evolving into a chorus of cries filled with pain and despair. I turned, searching for the source. What I saw next shook me to my core. Figures emerged from the darkness, distorted shapes writhing in agony. Their faces were contorted in expressions of unbearable suffering. Men, women, and even children reached out with trembling hands, their eyes pleading for help. Their voices rose in a desperate cacophony, a symphony of torment that pierced my soul. I wanted to look away, to shut out the horror, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, overwhelmed by the intensity of their suffering. These were not mere images. They were real. I could feel their pain as if it were my own, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush me. I had spent my life preaching about God's mercy, His justice, His infinite love. But here, in this place of anguish, those teachings felt distant and hollow. How could this suffering exist in the presence of a just and loving God? Questions flooded my mind. I tried to pray, to anchor myself in the words of Scripture that had always sustained me, but the prayers wouldn't come. Doubt clawed at my heart, an unfamiliar and terrifying presence. The cries of the suffering echoed endlessly, each one pressing deeper into my spirit. I stood in the heart of the unknown, caught between faith and fear, searching for answers I wasn't sure I would find. Who were these beings? What brought them here? Was this some form of reckoning? Their anguished cries grew louder, an unbearable weight pressing upon me. Helplessness surged within, a bitter irony for someone who had dedicated his life to guiding others. Yet now, in this place of desolation, I had no answers. Then, cutting through the cacophony, a voice emerged. It was deep and resonant, unlike any voice I had ever heard. It carried no anger, but bore a commanding authority that silenced everything in its path. "Dennis," it called, addressing me by name. There was a stillness to the voice, calm but unwavering. "Dennis." With each repetition, the cries receded into the shadows. I turned toward the voice, my pulse quickening. The suffering figure seemed to vanish into the darkness, leaving me isolated in a vast emptiness. The air thickened with tension, like the entire cosmos holding its breath in anticipation. I did not know who or what was speaking, but I felt deep within that this moment would redefine everything. Whatever lay ahead, I would not emerge unchanged. The voice called my name once more, reverberating with a power that pierced to the core of my being. "Dennis," it said again, not with wrath, but with an undeniable gravity that demanded my undivided attention. And then it asked, "Who is God?" The question struck like a bolt of lightning. "Who is God?" I echoed reflexively, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. It was a question I should have easily answered. I had spent a lifetime praying to God, studying His laws and teaching others about Him. Yet here, faced with this voice, the answer eluded me. The words I relied on felt distant and hollow. Again, the voice pressed, calm, yet relentless. "Have you truly known me?" Its question reverberated through the silence, carving deep into the stillness around me. My thoughts spiraled, desperately seeking clarity. Of course, I had known God, or so I thought. I had prayed daily, studied the sacred texts, and served Him with all my might, but the more I searched for an answer, the more I realized how much of that knowledge had become routine, assumptions built on rituals and doctrines. This was not a question of religious practice, but of true understanding. And in that suspended moment, I was no longer certain of what I knew. The darkness around me began to shift. The voice had opened something within, and now the void was alive with visions. Images that transcended time and challenged my beliefs. I saw Abraham on Mount Moriah, his hand trembling as he raised the blade over Isaac, his faith unwavering. I saw Moses on Sinai, the commandments burning with divine brilliance. These were stories etched into my soul, narratives I had proclaimed with conviction for years. But then the visions shifted again. I beheld a man I did not recognize walking a dusty road. His face radiated peace and unshakable purpose. He was surrounded by a crowd. Fishermen, laborers, women, and children surrounded him, their eyes fixed on his every move. Though I couldn't hear his words, his voice carried a presence that resonated deep within me. Who was this man? He didn't belong to the stories I had known and shared, yet he felt profoundly familiar. The scene shifted, and I watched him perform acts that defied understanding. He touched the eyes of a blind man, and the man's face lit up with astonished joy as his vision was restored. I saw him kneel beside a crippled man, gently lifting him to his feet. The man stood, walking with strength that should have been impossible. These were not like the grand signs of Moses or Elijah. They were different, intimate, personal. The vision grew brighter. I saw the man addressing a vast crowd, his voice steady and filled with authority. "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he declared. "No one comes to the Father except through me." The words washed over me like a powerful wave, leaving me breathless. Their meaning struck with an unsettling clarity. This was Jesus, the one I had only known through distant stories, obscured by doubts and theological divisions. Yet now he stood before me with undeniable reality. The visions continued to weave together, merging truths I had always thought separate. I saw Moses receiving the commandments, the stone tablets glowing with divine authority. Then I saw Jesus, lifting a loaf of bread and breaking it for his disciples. "This is my body given for you," he said. The connection between these moments overwhelmed me. Two distinct covenants, two seemingly separate worlds, were now threads of the same divine tapestry. As I struggled to comprehend it all, the voice spoke again, this time not from some distant void, but from within my very soul. "Dennis, you have spent your life seeking me, but have you truly found me?" Tears welled in my eyes and streamed down my face. "I have tried," I whispered. "I thought I understood, but now I don't know anymore." The visions faded into a radiant, blinding light. From within that brilliance, a figure stepped forward, the same man from the visions. Jesus. His presence overwhelmed me, not with power, but with compassion. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw a depth of love and understanding that unraveled every defense I had ever built. He did not need to speak for me to feel the weight of his presence. But when he did, his words carried a truth that struck me to my core. "Dennis," he said gently, yet with authority, "you have known the law and the prophets, but now the fullness of truth stands before you. I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. You have sought God through the commandments, and they are good, but the path to the Father is through me." The weight of his words brought me to my knees. It wasn't condemnation, it was an invitation. "Why me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why now?" Jesus stepped closer, his gaze unwavering but kind. "Because you have the courage to ask," he said, "to seek beyond what you know. That is the first step toward truth." He paused, his expression softening. "Dennis, what you have believed and taught has not been in vain." His words reached into the very depths of my being. This was not the end of my understanding, but the beginning of a new path, one I had never seen before. "Your devotion has brought you this far," Jesus continued, his voice steady and compassionate. "But there is more to understand. The question is, will you have the courage to follow where I lead?" The light around him pulsed gently, as if awaiting my response. Overwhelmed, I wrestled with the weight of all I had seen and heard, my heart and mind caught in a storm of uncertainty. Before I could speak, he added one final message. "Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened." The light intensified, enveloping me completely, and the vision began to dissolve. His words echoed in my mind, simple yet immeasurably profound. Whatever awaited me now, I knew my life could never return to what it had been. The transition back to my body was jarring, almost violent. One moment, I was immersed in divine truth and love, and in the next, I was gasping for air, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights searing my eyes. My chest felt leaden, my limbs weak, and the mechanical beeping of monitors filled the room. Voices, urgent and relieved, swirled around me. "He's back," someone said. A familiar face appeared above me. Miriam. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying. She seized my hand, tears of relief streaming down her face. I had survived. But the word survived felt inadequate. I hadn't just come back from the brink of death. I had been somewhere else, experienced something far beyond this world. Its weight pressed down on me with a gravity I could hardly bear. The hospital became my refuge for several days as the medical team monitored my condition, astonished by my recovery. They spoke of how close I had been to death, marveling at my survival. But for me, the physical healing was secondary to the storm brewing inside. The vision, the voice, and my encounter with Jesus refused to fade. They were more vivid than anything in my earthly reality, yet they left me awash in questions without answers. At first, I tried to push the experience aside. I returned to my prayers, reciting the familiar words I had known since childhood, but the prayers felt different now, hollow, as though they had lost their meaning. Everything I had devoted my life to seemed incomplete, as if missing a critical truth I had never grasped. I wanted to dismiss the vision, to explain it away as the delirium of a dying mind. But I couldn't escape the memory of Jesus' words, "Seek, and you will find." Those words gnawed at the edges of my soul, drawing me towards something I couldn't yet name. I spoke to no one about what had happened, not even Miriam. How could I? How could I reveal this without shaking the foundation of my faith and the life I had built? Instead, I bore the burden in silence, immersing myself in study. I pored over the Torah, hoping for clarity. But the answers I sought eluded me. The texts that had once guided me now felt distant, unable to address the new questions that consumed me. One day, seeking respite from my inner turmoil, I went for a walk. My thoughts were a blur as I wandered aimlessly, hoping to clear my mind. As I turned a corner, I found myself in front of a small church. Something about it held my attention. The doors were open, and soft, melodic singing floated outward, gentle and inviting. I hesitated, feeling like an outsider. Yet that same pull, the one I had felt during the vision, drew me forward. Before I fully understood why, I stepped inside. The quiet atmosphere wrapped around me like a comforting presence. An older man in clerical robes approached, his expression warm and welcoming. "Good afternoon," he greeted me with a kind smile. "I'm Pastor Thomas. Please, come in and make yourself comfortable." I nodded and took a seat, my mind still spinning. Moments passed in silence before, almost involuntarily, I began to speak. I told him everything, about the illness that had nearly taken my life, the vision I had experienced, the voice that had called my name, and my encounter with Jesus. Pastor Thomas listened attentively, never interrupting. His eyes reflected a deep understanding, not shock or disbelief. It was as if he had heard such stories before, though each detail mattered deeply to him. When I finished, he remained quiet for a moment, allowing the weight of my words to settle between us. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle. "Dennis, what you've experienced is not something to fear or dismiss. Sometimes, when we are at our lowest, God reveals himself in ways we never expected. Perhaps what you saw was his invitation, an invitation to seek him not only through the law you have followed, but through something greater, something fulfilled in Christ." His words echoed the very thoughts I had been afraid to admit to myself. This was no longer just a vision or a fleeting moment. It was a turning point, a challenge to confront the deeper truths I had spent my life avoiding. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but I knew now that I could no longer ignore the call. When I finished my story, Pastor Thomas handed me a Bible. "You've been given a gift," he said softly. "It won't be an easy path, but truth rarely is. Perhaps this will help you along the way." At first I hesitated. Opening the Bible felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, like crossing a line I had never dared approach before. But one restless night, unable to sleep, I finally reached for it. As I began to read, the words, though new to me, felt strangely familiar. They carried the same weight of authority and compassion I had encountered in the vision. Jesus' teachings about love, grace, and truth spoke directly to my heart, offering answers to questions I hadn't even known I was asking. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The turning point came when Pastor Thomas invited me to join a Bible study group. I was apprehensive, unsure of how I would be received, but the group welcomed me with warmth and sincerity. For the first time, I felt free to voice the questions and doubts that had been haunting me. The group's responses were thoughtful and patient, reflecting the same love and understanding I had felt in the presence of Jesus. As the weeks passed, my heart began to transform. The doubts that had once burdened me started to lift, replaced by a peace unlike anything I had ever known. I realized that the teachings of Jesus didn't contradict my understanding of God. They completed it. The day I decided to follow him was both the most difficult and the most freeing moment of my life. When I shared my decision with my family, their reactions were deeply mixed. Miriam was heartbroken, struggling to comprehend how I could turn from the faith we had built our lives on. My children were confused, their questions reflecting the very ones I had once wrestled with. It was painful, but I knew I couldn't turn back. I prayed for their understanding, trusting that God would touch their hearts as he had touched mine. Today, my life is profoundly different from what it once was. I still carry the wisdom of the Torah with me, but it has been illuminated by the light of Jesus' teachings. My journey is not about leaving my heritage behind. It is about the fulfillment of all I have sought. I share my story not to convince, but to testify to the transformation that occurs when we pursue truth with open hearts. If my story has touched you in any way, I invite you to leave your name in the comments so that we can pray for you. Prayer is a powerful source of guidance and strength on this journey we all share. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to hear more incredible stories of near-death experiences and spiritual transformation, check out the videos on the screen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support our channel. May you find peace and truth on your own path. God bless.